Yeah, I'm going to call the committee to order at this time. We'll ask all the members if they can come in and take their seats for this hearing. And let me begin by pointing out that Ukraine is facing not one crisis, but a number of them. Its new government is confronting an economic and financial crisis brought on by years of mismanagement, years of corruption by previous government officials. And it is doing this while under military invasion and economic coercion by neighboring Russia. The world has been speaking up, sending a clear message, and that message is that Moscow's actions over the past week are out of bounds. The new government in Kiev cannot succeed without strong and rapid support by the international community. Working in close cooperation with our European allies, the U.S. is crafting an immediate assistance package. But this help must be accompanied by fundamental economic reforms if Ukraine is to stabilize its economy. Only Ukraine can help us help them. I'll also mention that later this month, prior to the elections in Ukraine, I will be leading a CODEL to the country because we must also help to ensure that the elections scheduled for May will be fair, will be free, and reflect the true voice of the Ukrainian people in all regions of the country, a country that is becoming increasingly divided. And I think our oversight and engagement there right now is very important. A successful election is essential to Ukraine's ability to resolve the many issues it's got on its plate and to advance toward democracy and security and long-term toward prosperity. Addressing Ukraine's energy security must be part of our response. Russia has repeatedly used its supply of natural gas to pressure Ukraine economically and politically, and has announced that it will significantly increase its cost in a deliberate effort to squeeze Ukraine. Fortunately, we have an option to help counter this threat, namely reducing the current impediments to exports of American gas to the Ukraine. The administration has it within its power to do this by removing the current bureaucratic obstacles that only empower Putin. They should do so rapidly. This committee is working to provide appropriate assistance to all Ukrainian people, but also to pressure Russia to withdraw its forces and cease its efforts to destabilize Ukraine. As part of that effort, immediately following this hearing, we will mark up a resolution that the ranking member and I have introduced that condemns Russia's aggression and outlines these steps. I strongly encourage the administration to increase efforts to isolate Russia diplomatically. There is much that should be done, such as introducing a resolution at the UN Security Council that condemns Russian aggression, isolating Moscow. The rest of the international community will support such a resolution. Moscow alone will veto it, but it will increase the pressure. The Treasury Department should also make clear that the U.S. is on the lookout for Russian banks that are involved in illicit activities, such as the transfer of stolen Ukrainian assets, especially those banks that are primarily owned by the government or by the oligarchs. We also, in our resolution, lay out other steps that should be taken, such as the limitation on travel. Many of us have been calling for action. And last evening, the administration called me to indicate that it was going to take steps on precisely these issues, the visa and asset bans here. And so we will look forward to that statement from the administration, I think, further elaborating the executive order announced early this morning. But we must remember that the purpose of our pressure on Russia is not simply to punish aggression, and certainly it is not to escalate the confrontation, but instead to move Putin toward a resolution that protects the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That is our ambition here. And as we look forward, we have with us today 3 administration witnesses to answer questions from members regarding the current situation in Ukraine and the administration's ongoing efforts to provide assistance to Kiev and to pressure Russia. The ranking member will be here shortly, and while he's en route, I'll also take this opportunity to introduce our witnesses. We have limited time this morning, so before I introduce the witnesses, we're honored to have with us today Ambassador Motzik from the Embassy of Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador, we know that it is a very difficult time for your country, and we want to extend a very warm welcome to you. As you can see, Ukraine has many friends on this committee. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by representatives from the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Department of the Treasury. A career Foreign Service officer, Mr. Eric Rubin, previously served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow from 2008 until 2011, before assuming his duties as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. With over 20 years of experience working in international developments in the region, Ms. Paige Alexander is the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Mr. Dalip Singh is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He advises the senior economic leadership at the Department of Treasury in the White House on global markets. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be part of the record. I'm going to encourage you all to summarize and just use your time to present your viewpoints, and afterwards the members will have 5 calendar days to submit statements and questions and any extraneous materials for the record. Without objection, as member offices were notified last night, in light of our time constraint, Mr. Engel and I are suggesting we limit to 3 minutes per member to help maximize participation of all the members this morning. And if I could now go to our ranking member, Mr. Engel, whose family is originally from the Ukraine, Mr. Elliot Engel from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Assistant Rubin, Assistant Administrator Alexander, Deputy Assistant Secretary Singh, thank you for appearing before the committee today and for your tireless efforts over the past several months in support of Ukraine. And let me thank Chairman Royce for calling this hearing on an issue which is in the forefront of all our minds right now. Since 1991, the U.S. has strongly supported a democratic, prosperous, sovereign Ukraine, and in keeping with this commitment, we supported a peaceful, negotiated resolution of the recent crisis there, as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens came out in the streets of Kiev and throughout Ukraine to express their desire for a more democratic and just state. The recent selection of a new interim government signaled that Ukraine was back on the path towards stability in political and economic health, but instead of welcoming this event, as was the case in the U.S. and Europe, President Putin has reacted in a very different and very disturbing manner. So let me be clear. President Putin's aggressive military actions in Crimea flagrantly violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They violate international law, and they violate Russia's commitments to Ukraine. They are deeply destabilizing and have serious implications for security in Europe. All of us should be profoundly concerned about this. And furthermore, his justification for this aggression is completely unsupported by the facts. There have been no persecution of Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine. All credible observers agree on this point. So I believe this is a critical moment. The U.S., our European allies, and the international community must stand up for Ukraine's unity and territorial integrity. Russia has deep historical and cultural ties with Ukraine, and Russia and Ukraine should enjoy good and close relations. President Putin must respect Ukraine's sovereignty and the right of its people to freely make their own choices and chart their own future. And Russia must also understand that there are consequences for its aggression. I think we should consider a range of sanctions, including visa bans, freezing assets, and banking sanctions, so that President Putin understands that this will not be business as usual. I call on our European allies and other members of the international community to take similar measures. I also support the administration's initiative to send international observers to monitor the situation in Crimea and other parts of Ukraine. Russia, in turn, should welcome such a mission, return its troops to their bases immediately, and comply with its commitments. Our other immediate priority should be to help Ukraine's interim government deal with the formidable challenges that it faces. Secretary Kerry was just in Kiev, and this was the right time to go and the right way to show our support. Given Ukraine's dire economic situation, we and our European allies should be ready to provide a robust assistance pledge. I strongly support the administration's initiative to provide loan guarantees to Ukraine, and I'm very pleased that the House will pass legislation authorizing these guarantees later today. I also welcome the EU's announcements that will also provide very sufficient loans and credits, and of course, we must also support Ukraine's efforts to reach an agreement with the IMF and implement reforms to address structural weaknesses. We should also provide additional assistance in areas of urgent need, such as to help Ukraine recover looted assets, combat corruption, conduct free and fair new elections, increase energy security, and counter politically motivated trade actions by Russia. With regard to this last point, I also believe we in the EU must steadfastly support other nations facing similar Russian pressure, such as Moldova and Georgia. As Ukraine's leaders restore stability and order in the country, I urge them to reach out to all groups and regions and to work together to build a tolerant, pluralistic society. The interim government and any Ukrainian government must protect the rights of all minority populations and make it clear that it represents all Ukrainian citizens. Let me take this opportunity to say a word about anti-Semitism, which has been mentioned as another justification for Russian military aggression. I recognize that there is a concern, but as the respected NCSJ recently stated, and I quote, "While there has been isolated incidents in Crimea and eastern Ukraine since the protests began in November, there has not been a pattern of violence against the Ukrainian Jewish population," unquote. And finally, let me once more thank all witnesses and the administration for its tireless effort over the past several months to support democracy in Ukraine. As the people of Ukraine confront the many challenges ahead, they should know that the United States will stand with them. We will support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we will support Ukrainians' aspirations to build a more democratic, prosperous, and just future for their country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to go to Mr. Rubin.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of this committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today on U.S. policy toward Ukraine. I'd also like to express appreciation for Ukrainian Ambassador Motzik joining us today. We very much appreciate his presence. Let me begin by thanking this committee for its deep engagement on this issue. In our efforts to back the aspirations of the Ukrainian people, we have been heartened by the robust bipartisan support that we've received from this committee and from Congress more broadly. House Resolution 447, introduced by Ranking Member Engel and passed by the House on February 10th, sent a powerful message that the American people stand wholly and unequivocally with the people of Ukraine in their hour of need. You have notified us that you're marking up a new resolution today, and we welcome your leadership. We've had close and constant contact with Congress in every step of this grave situation. Our united efforts have demonstrated to the people of Ukraine and to the international community that the United States is resolute in its support of Ukraine's desire for a democratic, peaceful, and prosperous future. I'd like to address two areas in my remarks. I will begin by discussing the political situation in Ukraine. Second, I will talk about regional stability, Russia's military intervention in Ukraine, and the response of the United States and the international community to Russia's action. I've submitted a more detailed written testimony for the record. I underscore that the situation in the region is extremely fluid and changing by the hour. We continue to adapt as it evolves. I would also like to underscore that the situation has changed as recently as this morning, and we have taken additional actions as recently as this morning, which I'm prepared to discuss in further detail. Let me also add a few words about my own deep personal commitment to Ukraine and its future. I first worked to support the Ukrainian people and their aspirations for freedom in 1989, when I was the Internal Politics and Nationalities Affairs Officer on the Soviet desk of the State Department. I helped open relations with independent Ukraine in 1991, and my wife and I lived and worked in Kiev from 1994 to 1996 in the early days of Ukraine's independence. I speak Ukrainian, and I have friends throughout Ukraine. Over the tumultuous events of the past several months, I've watched with horror as Ukrainians were cut down by snipers in the heart of Kiev. But I've also been inspired by the people of Ukraine, their determination, their courage, and their insistence on the possibility of a better future for themselves and their country. I would like to start by emphasizing that the democratic transition that has occurred in Ukraine is an expression of the will of the Ukrainian people. It is not about the United States. It is not about Russia. The people of Ukraine have made a decision about their future. The Rada, the country's democratically elected parliament, has taken the steps of creating a transitional government following former President Yanukovych's abdication. Ukraine's lawmakers in the Rada have fulfilled their obligation to the people by preparing to tackle pressing economic and political issues facing the country until new presidential elections can be held in May. These decisions have been supported by overwhelming majorities in the Rada, including members of President Yanukovych's party. The United States welcomed the formation of the new government and is working with its leadership as it ensures the protection of the rights of all Ukrainians, including all members of minority groups. As the international community looks for ways to help Ukraine, we will focus on the government's efforts to build a strong, sovereign, and democratic country reflecting the will of the people of Ukraine. The decision of the Ukrainian people regarding their government needs to be respected. Russia's military intervention in Ukraine has endangered the promise of Ukraine's democratic transition. As Secretary Kerry said in Kiev on Tuesday, the contrast could not be clearer. Determined Ukrainians demonstrating strength through unity, and a Russian government out of excuses, hiding its hand behind falsehoods, intimidation, and provocations. The United States fully and unambiguously condemns Russia's military intervention in Ukrainian territory. We've repeatedly indicated that Russia's actions in Crimea are a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity and a breach of international law, including Russia's obligations under the UN Charter and of its 1997 Treaty of Friendship with Ukraine, as well as Russia's basing agreement of 1997 with Ukraine. Russia agreed in that treaty to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine and not to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs. This is also a blatant affront to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and the Helsinki Final Act. We have already taken actions consistent with the unacceptability of Russia's military intervention. Shoulder to shoulder with our G7 counterparts, we have suspended participation in the G8 Sochi preparations. We have suspended all talks with Russia on any future trade or investment agreements. We have suspended military-to-military contacts. We have issued a statement with the unanimous approval of the members of the North Atlantic Council strongly condemning the Russian military escalation in Crimea. NATO is stepping up efforts to increase our Baltic air policing mission, and we are working on ways to strengthen our aviation detachment cooperation with Poland. We are considering other measures to provide reassurance to our allies. And today, the United States has marshaled a full package of measures aimed at demonstrating the force of U.S. resolve in the face of unprovoked military aggression, intervention, and threats. Pursuant to the President's guidance, the State Department is putting in place visa restrictions on a number of officials and individuals, reflecting a policy decision to deny visas to those responsible for or complicit in threatening the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In addition, the President has signed an executive order that authorizes sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for activities undermining democratic processes or institutions in Ukraine, threatening the peace, security, stability, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of Ukraine, contributing to the misappropriation of state assets of Ukraine, or purporting to assert governmental authority over any part of Ukraine without authorization from the Ukrainian government in Kiev. We've made it clear to Russia and others that steps to undermine Ukrainian democracy and territorial integrity will result in further political and economic isolation should they continue on this path. Mr. Chairman, our focus remains on de-escalation of tensions. We continue to explore the possibility of an off-ramp that could lead to the relaxation of tensions in Ukraine, if the Russians are willing to take it. We support direct talks between the Ukrainian and Russian governments. Secretary Kerry met yesterday in Paris separately with the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia, as well as with European counterparts, in an effort to get such talks going. The OSCE and the United Nations are in the process of deploying monitors in the country, including Crimea and eastern Ukraine. These monitors will provide transparency about the activity of military and paramilitary forces, monitors for abuse, and diffuse tensions between groups. They, along with senior delegations from our NATO allies to the region, will offer objective, on-the-ground information to counteract Russia's flagrant propaganda campaign. And let me be clear on this point. There are no confirmed reports of threats to ethnic Russians, no confirmed reports of a massive movement of ethnic Russian refugees, no threat to Russian naval bases. The interim Ukrainian government is a body that represents the will of the Ukrainian people. It is not an extremist cabal. Russia's assertions are nothing more than a veneer used to justify its military action. I would also like to state before this committee that the United States is closely monitoring reports of anti-Semitic acts. We take this issue very, very seriously. It's an issue I've worked on for more than 20 years personally, and I would like to concur with the statement that you made indicating that we have no such information indicating that there are widespread anti-Semitic incidents. We have been in touch with the chief rabbi, with leaders of all the major Jewish groups in Ukraine, and we believe that this accusation is again being used to justify an unjustifiable military intervention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rubin. Now, we have 5 minutes for opening statements. And so, Paige, if you could summarize, I think that's for the best. Ms. Alexander.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today regarding the U.S. assistance package for Ukraine.
Paige, go ahead and put the microphone there.
Sorry. So recent events are momentous for Ukraine, and the response of the United States government is critical to the region's future. The U.S. is working with our international partners, especially the International Monetary Fund, to provide needed support to Ukraine's people and the economy as they face this current crisis. Our approach is to support the goals and aspirations of all people of Ukraine for peace, prosperity, freedom, and human dignity, the very things that the people have been on the Maidan for the last 3 months explaining their concerns. So as the chairman mentioned, for the upcoming elections, USAID and our partners are moving forward with a series of programs in 5 specific areas to help ensure these elections are free, fair, transparent, and inclusive. We will work to improve the legal framework to strengthen election administration, support civic oversight of the electoral process through observation missions by domestic and international monitors, encourage civil society coalitions to advocate for further reforms, promote a more balanced, open, and diverse information environment throughout the country, and support a robust yet a fair political competition in informing the public through support for public opinion polls and ensuring training for party poll watchers. We also recognize that the more inclusive and accountable governance will not be established with just one presidential election. Over the mid to longer term range, we will pursue a multifaceted approach to strengthening Ukraine's democratic institutions and processes. Years of economic mismanagement have left Ukraine with a heavy debt burden, weak regulatory oversight of financial institutions, and an uncompetitive business climate. The ongoing economic instability has led to a heightened uncertainty in the financial sector, prompting the National Bank of Ukraine to impose capital controls as depositors become wary of the soundness of domestic banks. Recognizing the serious potential for failed banks, USAID will work to help provide banking supervision to increase public confidence. We realize that Ukraine's inefficient and import-dependent energy sector continues to be a significant drain on Ukraine's financial resources, and this needs to be addressed in the medium term as well. So U.S. technical assistance will be provided to the government of Ukraine as it makes important policy reforms and combats the widespread corruption that has prevented Ukraine from reaching its economic potential. We need to revitalize the support for the private sector, which has staggered in recent years under an increasing and uneven playing field and official harassment. USAID is working with many other agencies to develop plans to improve the financial sector transparency, reform the energy sector, and improve the operating environment for private sector businesses. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Engel, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on the issues of great importance, not only for Ukraine, but for the region and for the United States. This is a critical moment for an opportunity for Ukraine, and USAID is well positioned to help Ukraine meet some of its most pressing challenges. And as my colleagues have noted, the IMF will be crucial to those efforts. This concludes my testimony. I'm prepared for questions.
Thanks, Ms. Alexander. We'll go immediately to Mr. Singh.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I visited Kiev last week to meet with government officials and express our solidarity during this difficult moment. Secretary Liu has spoken several times with the Ukrainian Prime Minister, who has assured us that the government is prepared to take the necessary steps to build a secure economic foundation, including the implementation of urgently needed reforms to restore financial stability, unleash economic potential, and promote the economic aspirations of the Ukrainian people. The fragility of Ukraine's financial condition underscores the urgency of its new government committing to an IMF-led reform program and securing the financing it needs while difficult adjustments are made. The fragile economic situation in Ukraine stems from many years of poor policy choices, lack of reform, and corruption under previous governments, as well as the negative confidence effect from Russia's recent actions in Crimea. Ukraine's new leadership has declared publicly and committed privately its willingness to undertake the necessary steps to secure assistance from the IMF and others. And the United States has made clear that as Ukraine implements reforms, we will work with our partners to support the Ukrainian people and restore the country's economic and political stability. As part of this international effort, the United States has developed a package of bilateral assistance, funded primarily by a loan guarantee, that is focused on meeting Ukraine's most pressing needs. These efforts will complement what must be the centerpiece of an international assistance effort, an IMF program. Only the IMF has the capacity to provide the necessary large-scale resources and the expertise to design and support a reform agenda in Ukraine. An IMF program also sends the strongest signal of confidence to markets, businesses, and households at a time when sentiment remains volatile. More specifically, the IMF has the expertise to develop, in consultation with the Ukrainian authorities, an economic adjustment program that eliminates unsustainable economic imbalances, removes costly and poorly targeted government subsidies, and improves Ukraine's business climate and competitiveness. The central role of the IMF in this assistance effort is an illustration of why the IMF is so vital to U.S. economic and political interests. The IMF is the world's first and most active responder in an economic crisis. By providing financial support and hands-on policy advice, the IMF helps keep our allies and partners strong and prevents economic dissatisfaction from spiraling into political instability. This makes the IMF's role critical to our nation's economic well-being. When instability abroad washes up on our shores, lower U.S. growth results in fewer jobs, and our citizens' savings and 401ks are hurt through financial markets. For the United States to continue playing a leading role at the IMF as it helps Ukraine, one of the most significant steps we can take right now is to pass the 2010 IMF quota and governance reforms. Why is this so important? First, the United States is the only major economy that has not passed the 2010 quota reforms, and our inability to act has led other countries to worry that the United States is retreating from its position of leadership at the IMF at a time when its role is so pivotal to the future of Ukraine. Second, the quota reforms would support the IMF's capacity to lend additional resources to Ukraine if it needs bridge financing to a larger package. We should be in favor of providing as much financial flexibility and resources as possible to the IMF in support of Ukraine's financial stability. There exists broad support in the American business community for these IMF reforms. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Financial Services Roundtable, Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, Financial Service Forum, and Business Roundtable all agree that these changes are necessary and in the best interest of American businesses and the global economy. Part of the reason why the business community supports these reforms is that it's a safe and smart investment for the United States. The legislation will not add one new dollar to our overall commitment to the IMF. The IMF has a rock-solid balance sheet with liquid reserves and gold holdings that exceed all of its credit outstanding. The IMF has never defaulted on any U.S. reserve claims on the IMF since its inception 70 years ago. If we fail to pass the 2010 quota reforms, our voice may diminish, and we will miss an opportunity to bolster the fund's resources, and economies may turn away from the IMF towards regionalism, bilateral arrangements, or new institutions, which means that the United States will lose the leverage and influence it has built up over decades at a time when our leadership on the global stage is so critical. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, Ukraine has asked for our support during this difficult time, and the United States, along with its partners, should be ready to answer the call. Thank you.
Thank you, Deli. In the interest of allowing our newer members of this committee to ask any questions and get information that they need, I'm going to forego my time and pass to Mr. Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to only ask one question to give more people an opportunity to ask questions. I think I'm going to ask it to you, Mr. Rubin. Russia's exerted intense pressure, especially economically, on Ukraine in the past, and my fear is that Ukraine can expect more pressure in the months ahead. So how can we and our European allies help Ukraine and other countries such as Moldova and Georgia, which are attempting to build democratic states, resist this pressure? One of the things that worried me about leading to this crisis is that Putin, in trying to lure these countries into his customs union, offers them all kinds of goodies, bonuses, gas, money. And the European Union says, well, we'd like you to affiliate with us in an Eastern Partnership, but there are 12 hoops you first have to jump through, and then if you jump through them and land on your feet, we'll consider you. I really think that we have not, the playing field has not been leveled, and we create obstacles to having these countries join with us to look westward rather than eastward. They all complain to me when they come into my office. And what can we do to change this?
Thank you. I would like to first talk about the economic aspects of your question, and I think I can point to some recent action both on the part of the European Union and the United States to address the very concerns you're talking about, Congressman. I think most importantly, I would like to talk about the emergency assistance that we've announced, that the European Union has announced, which is tied in with the key reforms that the Ukrainian government needs to make to get its economy back on its feet. The European Union announced a major package this week, and Secretary Kerry in Kiev announced that we are starting to put together a package that will include a $1 billion loan guarantee that we've already been consulting with members on the Hill about, including this committee. And I think it's very important to recognize the perilous financial situation that Ukraine finds itself in under Russian pressure, but also under very serious previous mismanagement and bad economic policy. The new government has taken a very encouraging and promising set of steps, and we believe that the new government is very serious about moving quickly to get Ukraine back on its feet. It needs support. We are committed to providing that support, starting with not just the loan guarantee that we're talking about, but increased technical assistance and other forms of aid, and then most importantly, working together with our allies and partners so that it is the international community that's supporting Ukraine with the United States as a leading part of that effort. Moldova and Georgia are very vulnerable as well, there's no question, and we've been working very, very closely with their governments. We had the Prime Minister of Georgia here 2 weeks ago at the White House meeting with President Obama, Vice President Biden, the Prime Minister of Moldova last Monday, also meeting with the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State. We're working to do everything we can to help them financially, but also to provide the critical public and political support for the democratic choices of their people. And we'll be doing that in the months ahead, but I think it's very important to basically underline the point that this is a critical moment to give them that support now when you have governments that are making the right choices. We recognize that. We will be doing that.
Eric, you're a little too close to that mic. Just move it back a little bit. Eliana Ross-Layton of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing and for your excellent bill. The Magnitsky List, that's what I wanted to ask about, denying and revoking visas of Russian regime members who are connected to belligerent actions in Ukraine and freezing and prohibiting any of their U.S. property transactions are moves in the right direction, but now we must name and shame these persons, add them and other Putin officials responsible for human rights abuses, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia as well, to the Magnitsky List, which imposes similar sanctions. Adding these names to the Magnitsky List would make these sanctions permanent rather than an executive order that the president can rescind. I've already submitted many names to the Obama administration to add to that list since we passed the Magnitsky Act, and there are many names here, names, position, examples, and evidence of gross human rights violations. I will send a new letter to the administration asking for more names of human rights violators to be added to the Magnitsky List, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in that letter. And the president must take similar actions in Venezuela, where Maduro continues his suppression of the people who seek freedom and democracy. In the executive order of the president, he talks about actions or policies that undermine democratic process or institutions in Ukraine. Well, Maduro and his officials are also responsible for actions and policies that undermine democratic processes or institutions in Venezuela. And now is the time to act. 16 of my colleagues sent a letter to the president asking for those similar powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So, Mr. Rubin, my question to you is the administration considering adding more names of Russian officials guilty of human rights violations to the Magnitsky List? Is it simply a historical document for academics to ponder? Are we just going to stay with those few names that we have put on the list and have not added many since then?
Thank you, Congressman Ross-Layton. We are actively considering adding new names. The answer to your question is absolutely. We take the legislation very seriously, and I do not have any new information for you this morning, but that is something that is under active consideration.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me see if I can just do a real quick question. First, Mr. Singh, I know that the Treasury Department is working closely with the Department of State and the White House on a loan guarantee package for the Ukraine. And you talked about it briefly in your opening statement. But I was wondering if you can discuss in more detail how we in Congress can support and improve the capacity of the IMF to provide a guaranteed loan package.
Thank you for your question, Congressman. So the IMF, in any assistance package for Ukraine that's going to be credible, needs to play a central role. And the best thing we can do right now is to maintain our leading voice at the institution, the IMF, that is going to be at the heart of the assistance effort. If we don't meet our basic commitments to fund the IMF and pass the quota reforms, our voice may diminish. Now, there's a second reason. Passing the quota reform provides the IMF with more financing flexibility, particularly in the case where Ukraine could need a bridge, a short-term assistance package, as a means to get to a larger agreement with the IMF. Now, the IMF's on the ground, they're looking at the data. We don't know yet whether that flexibility will be needed, but it's a good idea to have it.
Thank you. And Ms. Alexander, as you prepare for the long-term engagement and development in the Ukraine, are you confident that the interim Ukrainian government is a stable partner for USAID?
Thank you, Congressman Meeks. The benefit of the people that we've worked with in Ukraine is that one of the development assets that Ukraine has is also its vibrant, multifaceted civil society. So we not only work with the Ukrainian government, we work directly with civil society. But we've been very impressed with what we've seen in the Ukrainian government thus far. We've been impressed with their restraint, and we consider them good partners. So we're confident that our money will be well spent.
And finally, Mr. Rubin, I'm a firm believer in multilateralism in a multilateral way, and I think it's vitally important for the United States to do that, to have this unified voice towards Russia for their action in Ukraine. How can the United States, and I think this is something I just want you to elaborate a little bit more, better engage our allies in Europe to ensure that we have the same strategic goals and long-term planning for a continued development and prosperity of the U.S.-European relationship? There seem to have been some cracks recently.
Well, thank you, Congressman. We have actually made this a very high priority, and Secretary Kerry has spent the past 2 days in Europe, in Rome and Paris, following his visit to Kiev, working precisely on that, working with our allies and other interested governments to try to craft a united international community approach to supporting Ukraine, to ending this conflict, to convincing Russia to withdraw its troops and restore its recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We agree that this needs to be a collective international approach. It needs to be a diplomatic approach. We believe that the call of the international community for this to be settled through dialogue, for Russia and Ukraine to immediately begin talking about this, can only happen if the international community is united in supporting this, and that is precisely what the Secretary is in Europe doing right now.
Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rubin, how do you assess the risk of escalation by miscalculation? With so many AK-47s pointing at each other, only one troop has to, or one soldier has to fire, and things could get out of hand. You mentioned the OSCE monitors. They've been stopped. As you know, they can't get in. And I visited OSCE monitors in other countries, including Georgia and Croatia and elsewhere over the years. They have such limited capabilities to mitigate a firefight or any kind of hostility. Secondly, I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, a few days after the Russians rolled into Abkhazia and South Ossetia. They several times put their tanks on a road as if they were going into Tbilisi, only to turn around. You'll recall that. Their objective strategically was Abkhazia and South Ossetia. What is the objective of the Russians now? Is it just Crimea, or are other regions and cities in Ukraine, particularly on the East Coast, or the East area, I should say, in the crosshairs? And Mr. Singh, if you could, Sergei Glazyev has said that Russia will abandon the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency if the U.S. initiates sanctions against Russia. How seriously do we take that threat sanctions now have been levied, as they ought to be. And the Eurasian Economic Union, a meeting this week with Belarus and Kazakhstan and Putin, talking about that union that comes into force in 2015. How does that play into all of this?
Thank you, Congressman. The question of international observers and monitors is absolutely critical, as you stated. We believe that the best way to de-escalate this very dangerous conflict, to ensure that there are no accidental incidents that lead to escalation, is to have an international presence, eyes and ears on the ground. And that is what we've been supporting. That is what the OSCE has been supporting. That is what the Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General is there for. We believe that they need access to all areas of Ukraine. They have access to all areas except Crimea. The Ukrainian government has been very supportive in encouraging monitors to come in to address any allegations of abuses, to address any concerns about minority rights. And that is the way to address these concerns, is through eyes and ears on the ground that can provide an objective assessment of what's going on and also be there as witnesses to what is going on. We find the fact that the monitors have had extreme difficulty in getting into Crimea, in performing their activities in Crimea, is very worrying. It's something that we consider unacceptable, and we believe that all the authorities involved, including the local authorities, have an absolute obligation to allow that to happen. And we will be pushing to expand the monitoring. We will be pushing to expand the scope of the monitoring. And without that, we fear it will be very hard to actually know what's going on. To answer your question as to what the Russians' objectives are, I have to say I think we all wish we knew the answer to that question. We've seen that clearly one objective is to militarily occupy and control the territory of the autonomous region of Crimea. We have condemned that. We consider it unacceptable. We believe the Russian forces must return to their barracks under their treaty obligations in the basing treaty with Ukraine. We certainly would condemn any further use of Russian military force or aggression on the territory of Ukraine. We hope that we will not see any further use and that we can return to a diplomatic dialogue to end this very, very unfortunate situation. And with that, let me turn to Mr. Singh.
Well, the reserve currency portion of it,
Yes.
Mr. Singh.
Congressman, let me give you a simple answer. Russia doesn't get to decide the world's reserve currencies or the United States' level of interest rates. That's determined by our economic outlook and our monetary policy. We have the most deep and liquid capital markets. We have the most attractive investment environment. This is not, we control our own destiny in this regard, not Russia.
We'll go to Albio Sires from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members that are here today. You know, I certainly believe that we should have strong sanctions. I don't think Putin understands anything else. But how can we get strong sanctions when Europe, over the last few years, have become more and more dependent on energy from Russia? And, for example, Germany didn't jump right away because, obviously, what do they get, something like 40% of the gas from Russia. So how can we get a consensus to come up with strong sanctions against Russia when they are so dependent? So, and the other question that I have is, Russia's threatening that if strong sanctions start to impact their economy, they're going to go after the assets that we have in Russia that are American assets. What are we prepared to do if they go after those companies and American assets in Russia?
Thank you, Congressman. Let me address first the question of coordinating sanctions policy with our allies and partners. The European Council of the European Union yesterday issued a very comprehensive framework for imposing sanctions, and the leaders of the nations of the European Union are meeting today to consider that. We believe that our allies and partners in Europe understand the seriousness of this. We've been working very closely with them, including Secretary Kerry's meetings throughout the past 2 days in Paris and Rome. And we agree with you that there needs to be a coordinated international approach to make clear to the Russian Federation that there will be serious consequences for Russia, for the Russian economy, for Russia's standing in the world, if Russia continues its current course of action. This is not intended as a threat. This is not intended as any form of economic coercion on anyone's part. This is intended to say that the international community is based on a set of principles, a set of laws, the United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, all of the obligations that members have toward each other. and it must be followed. That is the basic foundation of the international system and of the post-war settlement in Europe. So this is simply a clear message to Russia that Russia has to return to respecting those norms, those commitments, those laws. We believe that there will be coordinated international action, that it will not be just the United States imposing sanctions and other forms in response to Russia's actions. We believe we will see that very shortly, and we will work very hard to ensure that this is a coordinated international front. I would add just to say that we will very strongly support the rights of our companies, our investors, and the basic principles of international law and all the other obligations that countries have toward foreign investors, and we take that obligation very seriously.
Mr. Singh, can you address the issue of Russia?
Sure. Congressman, Mr. Rubin is right. We're working very closely with our European counterparts. But the reality is, Russia is it's a very large economy. It's a $2 trillion economy, 8th largest in the world. There are interconnections on the trade front, on the financial front, on the market front. It's important that we're proportionate in our response depending on Russia's actions. With respect to the energy question in particular, I would just observe there's a codependence. Yes, Europe relies, roughly a third of their energy imports come from Russia, but so too does Russia depend on those earnings, on those export earnings to Europe. And so they also need to be careful.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Putin's recent explanations for his aggressive actions in Crimea don't pass the laugh test. Putin suggests that he's obligated to protect his fellow Russians in Ukraine, when in fact Crimea was last part of the old Soviet Union back in 1956 when I was 3 years old, when it became part of Ukraine and remained so after the fall of the Soviet Union and the advent of an independent Ukraine in 1991. His arguments are weak and his actions are clearly in violation of international law. But unfortunately, there is the perception, at least, that there is a growing power vacuum around the world, and various bad actors are filling it, from the Middle East to the South China Sea, now to Ukraine. In the last few weeks, we've heard from the White House about consequences and all options on the table and so forth. It wasn't that long ago, my colleagues will remember, that we were hearing about drawing a line in the sand. And frankly, I fear that there may be a growing perception among our friends and allies in the international community that the United States, at least in the area of foreign policy, lacks resolve. So I hope our witnesses this morning will be able to alleviate some of those concerns. A couple of questions. Where are we in regards to our cooperative efforts with our European partners? I've heard some vague comments about consequences from European officials. How serious are they? Who are the players in the region that are working closest with us, and where are the weak links? It's been suggested that some of our allies in Europe would never agree to strong sanctions on Russia because of the fear that their sources of energy supplies would be cut off. Well, here's an idea. Perhaps our friends in Europe would be able to avoid that fate if they, in fact, produced more of their own energy, which is present but untapped because of their own domestic energy policies, which we encourage. Or even better, the Obama administration could reverse its anti-production policies. Approve the Keystone Pipeline, for example. Open up ANWR. Encourage the development of our shale export program. And the Europeans could buy their energy from us while increasing American manufacturing jobs. Just a thought. I've given you a lot to think about. Any comments?
Congressman, thank you. Let me say that in terms of ensuring that we have unity of purpose and action with our allies and partners in Europe, this is our highest priority. Again, this has been the main objective of Secretary Kerry's work in the past several days in Europe. We believe we've seen clear statements that the leaders of the European Union, of the European Union's member states, and of countries in Europe that are not members of the European Union are very serious about the threat that this set of developments poses, will take action, and we are working very hard to coordinate our action with them so that we are presenting a strong, coordinated front on this. Let me also say that we've seen action taken by countries not in the European Union and countries in the European Union already to impose sanctions, to freeze accounts, to take other steps, visa bans, to make clear that there will be consequences for violation of the international order. Additionally, let me mention that it is our highest priority to ensure that the solemn commitments that we have under the North Atlantic Treaty to our allies in Europe are upheld. We take that obligation with the utmost seriousness. We have worked within NATO in the past several days to ensure that we are prepared within the alliance to support all its members. We have taken action to expand our Baltic air policing mission, our aviation detachment in Poland. The North Atlantic Council issued a very strong statement on behalf of all the allies, and we'll be working very closely with them in coming days and weeks to ensure that the alliance stands strong and united on this. The last point that you mentioned, I would just like to say that energy diversification has been at the heart of our policy toward Europe for the past 25 years under every administration, and it remains at the heart of that. Obviously, there's still a long way to go, but we strongly believe that diverse sources of energy, lack of reliance on a single supplier is very important for Europe's security and future development. Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Brian Higgins of New York, or did you have a point you wanted to make, Mr. Singh?
I was just going to make the point that it's clearly important to collaborate closely on sanctions, but we should also acknowledge a very welcome announcement by Europe yesterday in terms of their assistance to the Ukrainian people. And what's important right now is that we all come together as an international community and meet Ukraine's financing needs as it makes the reforms it needs to achieve economic stability, which will pave the path to an independent political future.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Russia has violated all kinds of international laws, including the treaty they signed with Ukraine guaranteeing its borders, in return for which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Russia's occupation of Ukraine is a direct and clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. President Putin has acted like an international street thug. And in 1994, when Russia was included into the G8, it was in recognition that the post-Soviet Russia was behaving like an honorable member of the international community and not a rogue state. If Russia's behavior has changed, then it would seem to me that Russia's status as a member of the G8 should change a little bit more aggressively than simply a suspension. Their membership should be revoked. It should be revoked. Number two, NATO, which is 28 countries, including the United States and Canada, and 26 European countries, was essentially established to safeguard the freedom and security through political and military means. It was a vehicle through which democratic principles could be promoted. Any thoughts about the idea of permanently kicking Russia out of the G8 and offering membership to Ukraine in NATO?
Thank you, Congressman. As the White House announcement stated this morning, we have suspended all preparations for attending the G8 summit in Sochi, and as we've said previously, it's hard to imagine that the President would go under current circumstances. The larger question you ask, obviously, is something that the President will need to consider, and I think this gets to the bigger picture question, which is Russia's role in the world, how Russia participates as a member of the international community under the structures and laws and obligations that all members of the international community have toward each other. So I think the larger question is very clear. We, as I mentioned, take the North Atlantic Alliance and its obligations solemnly, seriously, and we are looking actively to consider how we can do more as an alliance to respond to this set of developments. But I would also add that we've said all along that the alliance is based on a set of values and commitments and principles, what kind of societies have come together. And in this case, we have stated publicly, for example, that Georgia will be a member. That was stated twice by the alliance and remains our position. And we believe that all societies should have the right, all countries based on the will of their people, to choose their alliances, their friendships, and the organizations that they wish to join. So that is just a basic set of principles, but that is something that each country should be free to decide for itself. That's the most important principle.
We go to Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rubin, I recently went to Russia, and I got the sense that Mr. Putin is sort of going back to a Cold War mentality. And this is more of a philosophical question. Do you believe that Russia is intent on reconstituting its empire?
I think, as I said earlier, I don't really want to speculate about why Russia is doing what it's doing, because honestly, we don't know. And I think what we have to judge is simply what is Russia doing. And what we see Russia doing is what has caused so much concern, and that is intervention on the territory of another sovereign state through military force and other coercive means.
Which, and my time's limited, which they have done prior. I think we learned from history. They invaded Georgia, and then they continued to occupy Georgia. I think that's very instructive as to the Ukraine experience today. In fact, Crimea just voted to join Russia. It was announced today, and I'm concerned that the same thing that happened in Russia will now happen that happened in Georgia will happen in Ukraine. And I don't know if these sanctions will stop that. That's my biggest concern. When one nation invades the sovereignty of another, definitions are important. We usually define that as an act of war. Does this administration believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an act of war?
Well, Congressman, we've said very clearly that we know what we have seen, which is military aggression, intervention in the affairs of a sovereign country, violation of legal commitments, violation of international law. That is what we see. That is what we're calling it. I'm not an international lawyer, so I wouldn't want to get into the terminology, but I think it's pretty clear what we're seeing. It is clear also that Russia continues to occupy territory of the Republic of Georgia. That's something we've been very clear in condemning, and it is also clear that there are commitments that all countries have to each other to settle their disputes peacefully, and that is certainly not what we're seeing here. So
Well, I do think we should call it what it is. I think you said it's very clear. It's a violation of international law. I believe it's also very clear that this is an act of war against another nation. When we look at the NATO, I think Mr. Putin feels very threatened by the European Union and NATO. Poland called for an emergency meeting of NATO to discuss its concerns about this Russian aggression. What are we doing to ensure that Poland and our other NATO allies are protected?
Well, one of the things we're doing is increasing our aviation detachment deployment. We are also working to ensure that the Baltic states have the support they need to defend their territory, and that is why we've increased our commitments to the Baltic air policing mission with additional planes and refueling. And we're working in Brussels at NATO to address any other concerns that the allies have. As I said, we take these obligations extremely seriously, and we will do our utmost to ensure that the alliance stands together.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
If I could make a quick announcement here before we go to Karen Bass of Los Angeles. Our strategy will be to recess. I think our witnesses know how Congress operates. We've got amendments up on the floor to the energy bill. There's about 6 of these amendments, 2-minute votes. So we will recess until we get to the recommittal debate, and that will give us time to come back and finish some of the questioning. And with that, let's turn to Karen Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe my question is brief, and it's for Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, on page 3 of your testimony, you talk about the IMF, and what is needed is an economic adjustment program that eliminates unsustainable economic imbalances and poorly targeted government subsidies. I was wondering if you could be more specific as to what those subsidies are, what needs to be changed, and then also, is the IMF support contingent on that?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So that's precisely how the IMF works, is that its assistance is contingent upon economic reforms being met, and these reforms are good for Ukraine. And the 3 core reforms that I referenced, number 1, there has been an unsustainable buildup in fiscal spending over the years in Ukraine. That needs to be addressed. Number 2, there are truly massive energy subsidies that have been that have played.
Subsidies to companies or subsidies to the population?
To the population, to tariffs that are paid for heating and gas and so forth. And that's led to a consumption of energy that's among the highest in the region.
Would you be concerned that some of the reforms might cause problems, dissent, if subsidies are cut off? You know what I mean?
So that's why our our notion on the loan guarantee is to try to direct the proceeds of that issuance, it's a bond issuance that we have in mind, and direct that towards the more vulnerable segments of the Ukrainian society so that those reforms are easier to implement and that they don't fall on those who can least afford to bear them. And then the third piece, apart from moving on the energy subsidy problem, which I mentioned has led to overconsumption and reliance on Russian gas, I should say, is on their exchange rate. It's overvalued. It's caused them to have a real problem in terms of exports. It's made their economy uncompetitive. One last thing is, I should say, it's very good news in terms of the political will that we're observing on the ground, that we're already seeing some movement on these reforms. The currency in Ukraine has weakened quite a bit and become much more flexible. It's becoming much more driven by market forces. That's a condition of the IMF, and the leadership of Ukraine has shown a willingness already to move in that direction. That's a very positive sign.
Do you think, I know that elections are supposed to be scheduled for May. Do you think there is the leadership there, or would the current person that's in power just run for election? And that's to anybody. And then thank you, Mr. Chair.
Congressman, the elections have been set for May for the presidential elections in Ukraine. Candidates have not yet been formally announced, nor has anyone formally submitted their candidacy, so we are not sure, but the current Prime Minister had indicated he would not be a candidate and would just be running the interim government. We'll have to see what develops, but we do believe it's absolutely critical that there be a fully free, fair election in Ukraine to choose its new president.
Okay, we're going to go to Mr. Bill Keating of Massachusetts. Would you like to have the last question before we recess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of quick questions. Number one, NATO Secretary General Rasmussen has said the alliance plans to intensify its cooperation with Ukraine. Could you give us a more detailed description in terms of NATO's plans? And if the Ukrainian government were to request a membership action plan, would the administration consider that, possibly support it? That's question number one. And the other one simply deals with IMF quota reform. Will that improve the flexibility to make sure that our dollars and IMF's funds are more effectively used and we don't have squandered money, that important taxpayer money from the U.S. and money from our European allies? Will that provide more ability to maximize the use of that? So those are the two questions. Mr. Singh can take the second. I don't know, Mr. Rubin, if you want to take the first.
Certainly, Congressman, thank you. On the question of Ukraine-NATO cooperation, Ukraine has been a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace for 2 decades, and we have very extensive positive experience working together with Ukraine on training, on improving readiness, on all sorts of questions that relate to building a modern military, civilian military control. And that is something that we certainly hope to continue. And Ukraine has a mission to NATO. We have regular meetings of the NATO-Ukraine Council in which that can be discussed. And as a matter of fact, we just held a session in light of current events at Ukraine's request. So we have a very, very strong partnership through the Partnership for Peace, through the NATO-Ukraine Council, and we do want to continue to develop that with the new government and in the future with the new president.
Specifically with the membership action plan, I can't see in the very near future, I can see the need to address this issue, frankly, because our options are limited now. And if Ukraine is interested and wants us to pursue this, will we entertain those discussions? Will we be supportive?
Well, Congressman, we've said from the beginning that countries need to be free to choose their memberships, their alliances, their commitments to other countries, that this is basic principle of sovereignty. And therefore, as a matter of basic principle, NATO is an open alliance. I think in terms of what the people of Ukraine want, what the government of Ukraine wants, will be up to them to decide, and we'll be very interested in having that conversation based on what they tell us.
Okay, and on IMF free quota reform?
Congressman, the answer is absolutely. This IMF quota reform would not require a single extra dollar of U.S. financing to the IMF, but it would preserve our lead role at the world's preeminent responder, the first responder to financial crisis. It preserves our voice and our influence at the institution that will be at the very center of the assistance in Ukraine. And by the way, It also increases the IMF's flexibility to respond to the situation on the ground in the event of the need for a bridge financing to a larger package. It should be a slam dunk.
Thank you.
Mr. Deutsch, you have a minute. That's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus the discussion a different way. In addition to targeting individuals responsible for undermining the democratic process and threatening the territorial integrity of Ukraine, are you considering additional robust sanctions that would have a more significant impact on the Russian regime? For example, will you look to impose sanctions, Mr. Singh, this is my question to you, will you look to impose sanctions that have been discussed previously for those providing the funding and equipment necessary for the Syrian regime to kill and terrorize its own people? That, it seems to me, is a way to really strike at Russia in a way that is significant and appropriate.
Congressman, let me just say, we've not listed specific individuals or entities today, but this is broad authority that we'll use as appropriate given the situation on the ground.
Is it appropriate to impose sanctions on those individuals who, in Russia, who are assisting the Assad regime in slaughtering its own people?
Well, Congressman, I can only say that this specific tool is designed to allow us to sanction those who are most directly involved in destabilizing Ukraine, including the military intervention in Crimea. But it does not preclude further steps to be taken if the situation escalates. I can't comment on your specific question on Syria, unfortunately.
So it does not provide the opportunity. Would you support, do you understand the opportunity, though, to impose sanctions in a significant way that would impact the Russian regime and the decisions they make by going after those who are responsible for aiding Assad? That's the question you can't answer.
I'll have to come back to you with a fuller response.
I appreciate it.
We stand in recess. This hearing is reconvened, and we're going to go to Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses. I think we all understand the urgency of the moment and the necessity of joining an international response to the clear act of Russian aggression. And I presume that many standard review or assessment procedures are likely to be expedited or maybe even waived. So I'd like to just ask you to speak to the sort of long-term obligations of the United States that we're contemplating. Typically, the United States requires that U.S. credits in volatile countries are administered by an independent facility administered under U.S. supervision. Will that be the case here? Who will administer Ukraine's payment of interest on the bonds and repayment of principal? Will the U.S. have effective oversight? How will that occur? And what do you assess the prospects for successful repayment? And what happens if that does not occur? And finally, in addition to the loan guarantee, what other sorts of aid is the administration considering for the Ukraine? I assume, Mr. Singh, you would be the best to begin.
Thank you, Congressman. The way the loan guarantee works is that the U.S. government guarantees the repayment of the principal and interest on a bond that would be issued by the Ukraine government. Okay, so the cost to the U.S., the way that it is calculated, is that there's an assessment of the possibility that the Ukraine government cannot repay the interest and principal, in which case the U.S. government would be responsible. And that is how it's designed. Now, the way we can mitigate that risk is twofold. One is that we make the loan guarantee conditional upon the existence of an IMF program, which has strong conditionality and increases the probability of repayment. And number two, we can use the proceeds from the loan guarantee to lessen the impact of those reforms on the most vulnerable segments of the Ukrainian society, and therefore that makes reform implementation, the success of it, more likely.
And in addition to the loan guarantees, what other aid is the administration considering, and what other things can we do to support that?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. I think the reality is we've had a bilateral support program with Ukraine since 1992. And we've spent a lot of money, and we've worked with the government, and we've worked with civil society very effectively. As we look at the fiscal year 15 request that we just made, obviously that was drawn up, as well as the 14 requests, before we knew what the actual needs were going to be. So as my colleague was talking about what the IMF team is looking at, USAID in particular will go in and look at the various elements of technical assistance needed to support that, whether it's through banking supervision, whether it's through energy subsidies, as we were talking about. But most importantly and immediate, I think we have the elections in front of us. And those are something that I think is going to provide a lot of emphasis for the Ukrainian people to recognize their true ambitions and where they want to go. And so we want to make sure those are as free, fair, transparent as possible.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses, and I appreciated your testimony earlier. Sorry for the brief break. Mr. Singh, wanted to build off a little bit of what one of my colleagues said earlier. Russia has threatened to not use the dollar as a reserve currency. They also have threatened to not pay back some outstanding loans to the U.S. and other European nations. Are you, again, at all concerned about that, or can you assess the validity of that threat, what that economic outcome of that might be?
Congressman, thank you for your question. I don't think it would be prudent for me to speculate about the various scenarios that could unfold. What I would say again, though, is that Russia does not get to decide whether the U.S. dollar is a reserve currency, and that we control our destiny in that regard.
And I appreciate that, sir. But with regards to outstanding loans, or can you just give me some idea as to the volume of loans outstanding that they have, if that is a threat? Are we talking about single billions, tens of billions, kind of order of magnitude where we're at?
We have some initial data on the amount of claims that reside in the U.S. financial system to Russia. Our exposure is somewhat lower than that of Europe, and as it relates to our system in particular, it's well under 1%.
Thank you. And then perhaps Mr. Rubin, or for any of you, understand from some of the materials that were provided this morning, the IMF is currently doing an assessment of the Ukrainian economy at this point. There's been some issues with transparency, some issues with full disclosure of the true state of that economy. I think the figures that I've seen, at least somewhere between 20 and 35 billion over the course of the next year or so. How long till that full assessment is done? And do you, with any degree of certainty, are you confident that that figure in there, again, is accurate, or is there a potential for what's needed to actually shore up the finances in Ukraine to be quite a bit larger?
Congressman, thank you for your question. On the actual figures, I'll defer to Mr. Singh, but let me just say that we've been saying now for years that Ukraine needed to address the very serious deficiencies, not just in its economic policy making, but in the entire way its economy was structured. And we've said all along that the way to do that was to engage in a serious dialogue with the International Monetary Fund, bring in the people who know how to do these assessments, and then have a serious negotiation. The previous government did not do that, and as a result, did not get the help and the advice that it needed. We're very encouraged by this current interim government's readiness to engage with the fund, to welcome the advice, and to begin making the difficult reforms. We believe that the package that includes IMF support, that includes IMF quota reform, which we do believe is critical to getting us to be able to have the kind of IMF support to Ukraine and other countries that find themselves in this kind of situation, is a critical part of that package. And then the bilateral assistance that we are committed to providing together with an IMF package that the European Union has now committed to providing can get Ukraine through this very difficult period, but also launch it on a healthy path back toward prosperity and economic stability. And let me just ask if Mr. Singh had anything to add.
Sure. I'll just say that there are a wide range of market estimates out there in terms of Ukraine's financing needs. I don't want to speculate without having the facts. That's why the IMF is there, as you suggested. They're going to provide that transparency in terms of the financing needs of Ukraine. I will say that in their estimate of what Ukraine needs, much of that's going to depend on the willingness of the Ukrainian authorities to undertake the needed reforms. And every indication that we have is that they're willing to make the hard decisions. So I should just add that the IMF and the international community have more than enough resources to meet Ukraine's needs, so long as it's willing to make the commitments to reform.
And any idea, if I can, Mr. Chairman, just any idea when we'll see that report from the IMF? Is that weeks away, days away?
It really depends on the speed with which the relevant data can be handed over and analyzed. It doesn't need to take a long time.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I appreciate it. Let me ask a question just about the brutality against reporters there. This is one of the concerns I have about the ability to get the free flow of information out around the Ukraine. We had both Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America targeted by security forces there, pro-Yanukovych security forces. We had 2 Radio Free Europe reporters who were badly beaten and then detained in January. A prominent journalist and contributor was forced to leave the Ukraine due to death threats in mid-January. And in VOA, we had a Ukrainian service TV reporter who faced repeated intimidation following his coverage of the Automaiden motorcade protest. So in the run-up to the next elections in the Ukraine, it seems to me that uncensored information, sort of a surrogate radio to give real-time information about what's actually happening on the ground and to discredit misinformation is going to be very important. What steps are being taken to increase messaging to the Ukrainian people? And specifically, one of my concerns is how do you focus that, target that to eastern Ukraine and maybe people in Crimea to make sure that they've got the real case of what's going on?
Thank you, Chairman. We have been working very effectively with the public diplomacy arm of the embassy to do exactly that. As you saw, the White House fact sheet yesterday came out about the top 10 myths that are being portrayed out there. The independent media has been a really bright spot that we've seen throughout Ukraine over the years. Just today, the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center was stood up by Ukrainian activists themselves. And these are things that we honestly don't have to financially support because they're doing it themselves. However, we are trying to give a bit of a bully pulpit and try to amplify the messages that they're putting out. I think you're right. In the lead up to the elections, that will be one of the most important elements, is to make sure that this information is out there. And we've been training journalists, and we've been working effectively with a lot of burgeoning stations that really have been trying to get the message out.
I do think, and I've talked to Croatian journalists and others, years ago I tried to restart Radio Free Yugoslavia. By the way, we never had that. That was the one country we never broadcast in during the Cold War, and I've had a number of reporters there tell me that you saw the way the Czech Republic and Slovakia handled this without any loss of life. They told me if there had been a surrogate radio like we had with RFE broadcasting into the country, it wouldn't have been possible with hate radio for each of these ethnic groups to whip up the types of hatreds that were created. And that's why I think at the end of the day, having this kind of capability going in before the election, while at the same time reassuring Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that the Ukrainian government is going to respect all languages. But I think these broadcasts have to be not just in Ukrainian, but in Russian. I'm going to follow up with you on that, but let me just say at this moment we're going to have to adjourn in order to get to the floor for the final vote. Thank you very much for your testimony here today.
Chairman?
Yes. This committee will come to order, and pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up House Resolution 499, condemning the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian independence, and territorial integrity by military forces of the Russian Federation. I now call up the resolution, and without objection, it is considered read and open for amendment at any point. Furthermore, without objection, all members here may have 5 calendar days to submit statements for the record or any extraneous materials that they might want to provide. And after my brief remarks, I think I will recognize those who wish to offer amendments. And, okay. After my opening remarks, let us do it this way. Any members who would like to speak on this resolution, let's get that debate out of the way, and then we'll go to the members' amendments, some of which will be accepted en bloc after they make their case. Some will be voted on independently that are more controversial. I'd also like to thank the members for their cooperation in considering this resolution so quickly. As we heard during this morning's testimony, Ukraine is in a very difficult, very tense situation. Time is of the essence. Congress needs to have its voice put in play soon on this, and this resolution is a straightforward declaration by the House in support of freedom-loving Ukrainians in their time of trial. It also condemns Russia's unprovoked aggression in no uncertain terms. This resolution is one part of a larger effort to provide assistance to Ukraine and to impose real costs on Russia for its actions, which this committee is working on. This resolution, among other provisions, condemns the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity by military forces of the Russian Federation. It declares the Ukrainian people have the right to determine their own future, free from outside interference. Importantly, the resolution calls on the administration to work with our allies to impose visa, financial, and other sanctions as appropriate. This action cannot go unchallenged. The action by Russia cannot go unchallenged, and as part of an effort to show Moscow how isolated they are, world leaders are speaking out. The House should speak out as well. And with that, I will open to the committee to any comments that members would like to make on the resolution itself at this time. Mr. Meadows.
I just would like to thank the chairman for his work and, quite frankly, for bringing this to the attention of the House in such an expedited manner. The chairman is correct in terms of the critical nature. Every hour makes a difference, and so I'd just like to thank the chairman for his leadership and the committee for their work on bringing this forward, and I support the resolution. Yield back.
Any other members who would like to be heard on the resolution at hand? Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
I support the resolution. Happy to co-sponsor it. I think it's important in this resolution not only to urge Russia to do what it should do, and I think the resolution does a good job of that, but to also urge those in Kiev to broaden their coalition, to include people in the government that were with the party that actually won the last internationally monitored election, and to not adopt measures that would question the use of the Russian language or reduce the level of official language status that the Russian language has according to laws that existed at the beginning of this year. It is, if we want a united Ukraine, the government in Kiev has got to not be a government of the winners, but a government of the entire country. And I hope that that is part of the message we send, whether it's in the text of the resolution or not, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Grayson, of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this resolution and strongly object to and condemn Russian interference in any other country, including neighboring countries. That being said, I think that the resolution fails to come to grips with the fundamental issue that's facing us around the world when we're addressing the situation, which is this. The Ukraine is an artificial creation, and specifically a creation of Lenin and Khrushchev slapping together a Ukrainian population with a Russian-speaking population and a Russian-Ukrainian-speaking population. Time after time, in election after election, we have seen a sharp geographic division in the country between East and West. In the West, you have Ukrainian speakers. In the East, you have both Russians and Ukrainians who speak Russian primarily. Once again, over and over again, we see in the West, one party winning 80 or 90% of the vote, the Ukrainian party. The other party in the East winning 80 or 90% of the vote, the Russian party. These are Siamese twins joined at the hip, and they need to be, over time, very carefully and tenderly separated. That's the only way that we're going to see any sort of resolution of the situation. I would hope to see a U.S. policy that recognizes that. I would hope to see a U.S. policy that favors regional autonomy and the right to self-determination to both sides of the country. It's clear now that in the West, there is a strong desire for the western part of the Ukraine to join Poland and other neighboring countries as part of the EU. That is not shared by many people in the eastern part of the country. The Russians and the Russian speakers in the East favor a different policy entirely. We have to come to grips with that. If autonomy means anything, it means the right to determine who it is who will be determining your future. In the West, there's a desire to see the EU to help determine the future of the Ukraine. In the East, there's a desire to see Russia help determine the future of the Ukraine. The area that the Russians are now using military forces to try to control is an area that voted for the deposed government with over 90% of the vote. Again, I don't in any way agree with what the Russians have done, but I do have to wonder what point there is in engaging in this kind of Cold War attitude, this us versus them attitude, and failing to come to grips with the underlying problem. Basically, we're talking about a country that cannot even agree on an alphabet. And as long as that remains true, there will be no peace in the Ukraine, regardless of what we do or what the Russians do. I yield back.
Yielding myself such time as I may consume. Let me point out that there are many countries in which more than one language is spoken. But in the case of the Ukraine, when the vote for independence came, the Russian-speaking portion of the country, as well as the Ukrainian-speaking portion, voted overwhelmingly for independence. Likewise, when the vote came on the referendum, basically, on Yanukovych, to remove him from his post, 328 members, both East and West, from the East and the Western portion of the country, voted in favor of his removal. That's 100 votes above and beyond the number required for passage, as indeed the parliamentarians who belong to his own political party, the Party of Regions, voted overwhelmingly in favor of impeachment. The EU observers, by the way, including the Polish and the French and the German foreign ministers, were at Kiev at the time and immediately affirmed to the media that there had been no coup, that in fact the overwhelming majority of Parliament had voted for a new government. Now, as Ukraine goes to elections in May, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us in the Congress, as we stress in this resolution, to encourage inclusion in the Ukraine. We recognize that polling in the Ukraine shows the overwhelming majority of people want an independent Ukraine. And yes, it's true. Some look east and some look west. And ultimately, it's up to the Ukrainian population to resolve this peacefully through their elected government. But I think we can assert the principle that Ukraine be allowed to serve both those roles, to trade to the east and trade to the west, to trade to the north to Poland and to the south with Moldova. I think that we have an opportunity also in engagement, and I hope to do this, in our delegation that we take with this committee in April in Kiev, to stress the importance of inclusion with respect to different languages, because so many conflicts start out over language. But in this particular case, if we recognize the history, part of this is because of Soviet meddling in the past. The eastern Ukraine once had an additional 8 million Ukrainian speakers. Joe Stalin, unfortunately, during the forced collectivization of the country, moved them out to Siberia. Most of them perished, most of the population that was moved. And subsequently, there were the purges under the Soviet system. So yes, Russian speakers moved in, but what's interesting about Ukrainian independence is the overwhelming support from all parts of the country, whether Tatar or Ukrainian or Russian-speaking. And given this important consideration, I think we have here before us a resolution that carefully explains, in a way that will help bring leverage to wind down this crisis, our recognition that all minority groups need to be included there. And I think the template for democratic governance, and I don't doubt this is going to be difficult because Ukraine does not have a history of compromise in its political system. But what we are suggesting here, and with further EU engagement, our hope is that we can help bring together the different political parties and factions. And the best way to do it is what's in this resolution, calling for an election in which everyone goes to the polls and a legislature which is representative, and then bring in the reforms which end the corruption, because also a portion of this resistance that you see in the country is to the historical corruption, the endemic corruption there. And that's the other issue that needs to be addressed, and we are addressing that as well with the engagement of Europe and the United States.
Well, the Chairman.
And I will yield to Mr. Kissinger.
I just want to make the point that in the as a Republican from Illinois, the United States actually votes quite differently based on geography, and in some cases it seems like we actually speak different languages as well. But we're able to stand together as one country and achieve a common objective. So I just wanted to add that to the Chairman's point.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Grayson.
Thank you. Responding to the point that was just made, if you go back and you look at the election results for the 1868 election and the 1872 election here in the United States, at the end of the bloodiest war that we have ever experienced, you don't see the polarization state by state that you see in the recent Ukrainian elections going back to 2004. There's actually a greater polarization today in Ukraine, determined by the election results, than there was in those elections. There was no state in the United States that voted as much as 80-20 in the 1868 election. Many, many provinces in the Ukraine voted more than 80-20, either for the pro-Ukrainian party or the pro-Russian party. That is the fact, and that shows that they've reached the end of the line. There must be some kind of acknowledgement of the fact that the people in the eastern part of the Ukraine do not want to be part of the EU, and the people in the western part of the Ukraine do not want to be lorded over by Russia. And we need to, if we're going to have any hope of progress, we need to recognize that. We've had our velvet divorces around the world before. Nobody claims anymore that the Czech Republic should be slapped together with Slovakia. Sometimes it's done in a less peaceful manner, as occurred with Sudan and South Sudan recently. But the fact is that there are irreconcilable differences between these two parts of the population. And I will vote for this resolution, but I think that it's a shame that the resolution does not acknowledge the basic fact that has caused the situation in the first place.
Could I ask if Mr. Cicilline would yield me some time? I understand the gentleman's point. I would point out, if we're looking at the 1868 and 1872 elections, I'm not sure, if you follow this logic, that would be borne out, because Confederate soldiers were not allowed to vote in those elections. Indeed, the distance between the North and the South would be far greater if they had been given the franchise to vote. This is different than in the Ukraine, because in the Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, those who had been on the side of the Soviet Union were allowed the franchise, were allowed the right to vote. I would make that as an example of the fact that we in the United States have gone through something as wrenching, perhaps more wrenching with respect to the Civil War, and eventually come closer together. I think the point that you make, Mr. Grayson, which is the most concerning one, is about the fact that the difference with respect to language itself creates probably more of a impediment than anything else. And that is an area where we can weigh in, where we can assure minority rights and do so and articulate the fact that all minority rights should indeed be guaranteed and respected. And I think this way forward is perhaps the one way we can underscore your vision of trying to address this issue. I do not think a balkanization of the East and the Ukraine would, based upon the polling that I've seen, it is opposed by the Ukrainians themselves. And I think a better resolution would be one, as I stated earlier, where Ukraine looks east and west. And I think this resolution overall urges that right to self-determination to all of the people of the Ukraine. Does Mr. Cicilline, did you want to reclaim time to make a point?
Well, thank you. Okay. You're like the timekeeper now. I thought the chairman made a great point earlier, and I just want to reiterate it to make sure it wasn't lost in his powerful overall point, which is the situation we see in Ukraine in terms of the ethnic divisions was engineered by the Russians. This was engineered by Stalin. Stalin intended to populate East Ukraine so that someday, whether it was in 2014 or whether it was 20 years after he did it, someday he could claim legitimacy to that very important part for him. So I hope that point is not lost, that this is something that was engineered in the mind of Stalin. I thank the gentleman from Rhode Island, and I yield back.
May I ask for some time?
Recognizing Mr. Grayson.
Thank you. Just to be historically accurate, it wasn't Stalin that added the eastern part of the Ukraine. It was Lenin and it was Khrushchev. So the gentleman seems to be misinformed in that regard.
If I could, it was Mr. Khrushchev with respect to, Mr. Grayson, yielding myself such time as I may consume. It was in 1956 that Mr. Khrushchev actually transferred Crimea to the Ukraine, thus creating the current boundaries of the country. And you're correct, Mr. Lenin, prior to that. But you know, so many countries across Eastern Europe are the consequence of these machinations over time. And I think the bottom line, again, is that self-determination has to be left to the people of the country. And I believe if we have a fair and free election in May, that this will be the best way forward for the Ukrainian population. Let me recognize Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to associate myself with your remarks, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate Mr. Grayson's reminding us of the historical context, but where do we go with that? I'm concerned about two things here. One is there's no end of boundaries and borders we could start redrawing based on artificiality or convenience, from the Mideast to Africa to, as you point out, Mr. Chairman, former Soviet republics. Many boundaries are very arbitrary, and you know, we've paid a price sometimes for that arbitrariness, but to go back in and decide that we're going to redo them all because somebody in history got it wrong, I think is somebody else's task, way beyond the work of this committee. Secondly, I also believe that the danger of dwelling too much on that is that unwittingly, it gives a rationale for what Putin has already done. The fact that the Crimea was added to the Ukraine in 1956 in no way, and I know Mr. Grace is not suggesting this, but in no way justifies what Russia and Putin have done. Who wants to go down that road in terms of that justification? So I believe the resolution in front of us is a balanced one, as you suggest, Mr. Chairman, and I intend to support it. I yield back the balance of my time. Did Mr. Kinzinger want some time? Or is he? All right. Mr. Chairman, I would yield back the balance of my time, unless Mr. Grayson wants more time.
I would simply reiterate that I have already indicated that I support the resolution, but I think the resolution is at best a half measure that doesn't acknowledge the underlying cause or attempt to come up with a solution. Self-determination has to be the key. The way to self-determination in the Ukraine is through devolution, local autonomy, and perhaps ultimately through independence. I don't see this crisis ending in any real way without that happening. I'll yield back.
I'm just going to close my arguments, yielding myself such time as I may consume with this point. The resolution does not assert a position on Crimean secession. What it does is call for all citizens in Ukraine to respect the current government authorities, and that's a necessary step in promoting stability and rule of law in the country. And the resolution also calls on the Ukrainian government to protect the rights of all minority populations within Ukraine, which is important particularly for ethnic Russian minorities in the eastern and southern regions. I think Mr. Duncan of South Carolina was seeking recognition.
I thank the chairman for his effort here. And I appreciate the comments that brought this into historical perspective, but the time in history that I think about as we talk about the Ukraine is 1776, 1777. I think about a people in Ukraine that are seeking liberty and seeking self-governance. And I think about when we talk about the Crimea and we talk about the different ethnicities of the Ukraine territory, I think about, should we be concentrating on trying to engineer another state, or should we let the Ukrainians deal with that? And definitely the Russians are involved in not just the Crimea, but by sinking one of their own ships and blocking the naval passage for the Ukrainian Navy to have access to the Black Sea for their own protection and their own protection of their maritime fleet. We definitely see Russia social engineering and militarily involved there. So when I think about 1776, I think about this being the Ukraine 1776 moment, pursuing self-governance, pursuing liberty, the things we take for granted in this country. I also think about their desire for help from another free country, the United States of America. And I think about the French courts at the time in 1777 when Ben Franklin is asking for financial aid so that this fledgling nation could win its war and win its independence and actually pursue self-governance. And so as we debate and vote further on today with financial loan guarantees, we need to keep in mind that we wouldn't be here had not another country stepped up to provide that opportunity for us. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Before we go to the en bloc, are there any other members seeking recognition on the underlying bill? Seeing none, in order to expedite consideration and with the prior concurrence of the ranking member, I ask unanimous consent that the following amendments, which members have before them, be considered en bloc. The Holding Amendment, number 15, the Kennedy Amendment, number 8, the Kinzinger Amendment, number 10, the Meadows Amendment, number 32, the Perry Amendment, number 31. Without objection, so ordered. Do any members seek recognition to speak on any of the en bloc items that they have? Mr. Kennedy of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to voice my support, obviously, for my amendment and the block that is now up for consideration. Includes an amendment that I offered that would include a reference to the resolution that the House already passed on February 10th. Additionally, it seeks to add a clause and has some grammatical corrections to make sure that that clause fits in, to state that the, quote, instability forced in the Ukraine forced 230 Peace Corps volunteers out of Ukraine. Mr. Chairman, as you're aware, I am a former Peace Corps volunteer. It's an organization that has a special place in my heart. And recognizing that on February 24th, 2014, Peace Corps announced that all Peace Corps volunteers in Ukraine are safe and accounted for, but they had to be evacuated, rounded up and evacuated. Peace Corps had been working in Ukraine since 1992 under an agreement brokered by President George Bush and the former Ukrainian President Kravchuk. To date, over 2,740 American volunteers have lived and worked in Ukraine, fostering a competitive, collaborative, and cooperative spirit between our two countries. They served in Ukrainian schools, bringing resources and innovative practices to the country's education system, fostering a foreign exchange of information and best teaching practices. They worked tirelessly on social and economic development, working in tandem with Ukrainian communities, supporting critical service providers, assisting local institutions, fostering cooperation between NGOs, government entities, and private enterprises. Perhaps most importantly for me, Mr. Chairman, Peace Corps volunteer named Alex Kaplan is a native of my district, and he was one of the many Americans who were evacuated from Ukraine within the last 2 weeks as the crisis escalated. He was teaching secondary education at a local school, as well as volunteering at a local animal and homeless shelter, a girls' orphanage, and several English language clubs. He talked in a recent article, a recent interview, about the strong bonds he formed with his community, and most importantly, the fact that he would go back in a heartbeat to continue his service once the threat subsides. Since the inception of the Peace Corps, volunteers like Alex have embodied the spirit of service, peace, and cooperation that are the fundamental pillar of American foreign policy. Their inclusion in this resolution underscores the enduring commitment to those values in a word that is freer and fairer than before. So I ask for your consideration for the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. We'll go to Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania and then Mr. Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just speak on behalf of my amendment regarding the paramilitary forces in Crimea. It seems that Mr. Putin continues to propagate the myth that Russia does not interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. The fact is that Russia has a very long history of interfering in former Soviet states, and it seems that Mr. Putin mourns the loss of the empire and has set one of his goals to reconstruct a modern version of it through his proposed Eurasian Union. But to do so, he needs Ukraine, and he doesn't need democratic revolutions so close to Moscow that threaten his de facto autocracy. So he reserves the right to resort to economic blackmail and, in Georgia in 2008 and now Ukraine, military intervention to keep his neighbors in line. Russia has been stoking separatist sentiment for years in Crimea and now is doing it at gunpoint. Strong evidence suggests that members of Russian security services are at the heart of the highly organized anti-Ukraine forces in Crimea. While these units wear uniforms without insignia, a violation of international law, by the way, they drive vehicles with Russian military license plates and freely identify themselves as Russian security forces when asked by the international media and the Ukrainian military. My amendment, and this amendment, simply reflects the consensus of international community and identifies the reality of the facts on the ground by calling on the Russian Federation to end its support for separatist and paramilitary forces in Crimea. And I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Sherman.
Just a brief comment. The Meadows amendment does call on the President not to attend the G8 or G7. I support that, but with the hope that Russia will respect the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, and nothing would make me happier than for Russia to do the right thing and the President to enjoy his trip to Sochi. But I don't want to offer an amendment on this. I think it's understood that we're calling for this boycott on the assumption that the Russians don't get the message between now and then.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Holding of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as we heard during our hearing, in both the immediate and long term, Ukraine is going to require a wide range of assistance from the United States and our international partners. My amendment adds a resolve clause to the resolution that expresses the support of the House to work with our partners in Ukraine to improve transparency, combat corruption, and protect individual rights through an independent judiciary and a strong rule of law. Making improvements in these areas will all be crucial to the long-term stability in Ukraine and they are also the foundation on which strong democratic governance is built. And I ask members to support my amendment and support the en bloc package. I yield back.
We thank the gentleman. Mr. Kinzinger.
Well, thank
Illinois.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for accepting my amendment in this package. It strengthens our underlying bill by adding, and it calls on the administration to oppose visa, financial, trade, and other sanctions on not only Russian Federation officials, but also on Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs and anyone else complicit in Russia's intervention and interference. The President's made it clear the steps that Russia has taken violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and are a breach of international law. I'm pleased Congress and the administration are moving forward together towards implementing tough sanctions, and would hope that our friends in the EU would consider the long-term implications that weakness towards Russia will mean. I'd also like to add my support for Mr. Keating's amendment. I've been concerned in what I've seen in terms of our allies, the French, having a naval contract with the Russians, and it's a naval contract to sell ships to the Russians that are actually beneficial in controlling the Black Sea coastline. And one of the difficulties Russia had in their illegal war with Georgia was their inability to control the Black Sea coastline. And this contract with French shipbuilders would actually give them that ability. So I hope our EU partners look very closely at their mill-to-mill relationship with Russia and consider doing the right thing on behalf of freedom-seeking people all over the globe. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Meadows, were you seeking recognition on your amendment? So recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll be very brief. The amendment, I appreciate the Chairman's consideration of this in block, basically calling on a boycott, joining with the President and asking other democratic states to boycott the G8 summit in Sochi, to convene a G7 summit at some place outside of Russia. I appreciate my colleague from California's pointing out Mr. Sherman and his support of the amendment, and certainly all of us want to recognize the fact that if Mr. Putin decides to go a different direction and reverse this course he's on, we will gladly look at restoring relationships. I also want to say that in spite of what may have been heard here today, I want the Ukrainian people to recognize that Democrats and Republicans, the administration and Congress, are joining together to make sure that we stand alongside the freedom-loving people of the Ukraine, and will stand up for them in this particular venture. And so I would urge the support of this amendment. And I thank the Chairman and yield back.
Are there any other members seeking recognition? Mr. Brooks of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been said that to some degree America has been playing marbles, which if you've ever played marbles as a kid, you know that the long-term strategy is not very in-depth, while Russia is playing chess. And if you play chess, you understand that you have to calculate each potential move of your opponent, and for each of those moves have your responses available and at hand in order to ensure ultimate success. In that vein, with the economic sanctions that we are seeking, I am inquiring of the members what our next move is depending on what Russia does. So if we evict them from the G8 and they become, or we become, a part of the G7, or if we do impose significant economic sanctions, what might Russia's responding move be? By way of example, how do we react if Russia's next move is to say we are no longer going to allow you to hitch a ride to the International Space Station? What does America do under those circumstances, inasmuch as we are likely years away from having a human spaceflight capability, given the President's rather unilateral termination of the Constellation program years ago, and the President's decision to not only mothball our space shuttles, but to put them in museums rather than have them available as a contingency, such as what has arisen. What do we do if Russia's next move is to say to the United Launch Alliance, as was evidenced by a hearing this week in the Senate, that Russia is no longer going to deliver engines to the United Launch Alliance, which in turn supplies our capabilities of launching satellites into space. Many of those satellites are military in nature, highly classified, and so my query to, say, Mr. Meadows or Mr. Keating or the chairman or any other members is, what is our next move if Russia decides as their next move to deny us access to manned spaceflight to the International Space Station, or denies us the rockets that we need to put our satellites in space? Now, don't get me wrong with my query. I intend to support this resolution because to a large degree I see it as authorizing the executive branch to determine what economic sanctions are appropriate, and I personally believe that that is the executive branch's responsibility and duty, and I hope that they will play chess rather than marbles. But please, if anyone has any suggestions in particular on how we're going to resume our manned spaceflight capabilities in a short period of time, I'd like to hear it.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
I think it's very interesting a cosmonaut and an astronaut are actually coming back together. If it hasn't happened already, it's happening within the next few days. Even during the Cold War, we had great relationships in terms of some of that. There was the Soyuz U.S. mission or something that happened. I also do wonder if Vladimir Putin, when he makes a decision to go into Ukraine or Georgia or terrorize his neighbors, if he sits around and wonders all these questions too, and then decides he doesn't want to do anything because he's afraid it might hurt our space alliance. So I would just humbly and kindly say to my friend that I think reacting from a position of strength on the United States is the best thing that we can do against this incursion into Ukraine. And while I think what is the next step is a worthy question to have, I don't think our adversaries wonder with quite the caution that the gentleman's asking the question. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, but I note that you did not answer my question. If anyone has any idea as to how we are going to engage in manned spaceflight if Russia does tit for tat, I'm anxious to hear. If anyone has any suggestions on how we're going to be able to launch our satellites, given our reliance on Russian engines, I'm anxious to hear.
Could I?
In the alternative, I would hope that the members of this committee would significantly increase funding for NASA so that we can very quickly resume those launch capabilities and return America to the preeminent position in space that we held for decades.
Mr. Brooks, I'm going to yield myself such time as I might consume. The point you raise is the very reason why we need to use the leverage that we have at our disposal right now in order to get Russia to recognize that it cannot continue to escalate this crisis in eastern Ukraine. You see, if we were to wait and not take action, it is probable that Russia would be emboldened to believe there were no consequences for its actions. And at that point, it might move or attempt to move its agents city hall by city hall across the eastern part of the country, encouraging them to lift the Russian flag and creating a division within each of those provinces, each of those communities, each of those towns, and thus really magnifying what could end up being a civil war within Ukraine in the east. However, if we take action now and show that there is economic consequences, and if Europe stands with us, and if Russia is isolated internationally, so that the vote, let's say, at the United Nations has only one vote in opposition, that's the veto from Russia, but the rest of the international community all calling here for the rule of international law, then it's quite probable that with that type of leverage, we can de-escalate this conduct on the part of Putin and get us back to the point of cooperation. But at this point, if we do not take decisive action, then it is far more likely that the escalation will eclipse the joint cooperation on programs such as the one you're most concerned about right here. So in that context, I would suggest that this is the most responsible action we can take in order to weigh in and have Russia consider the considerable downside effects should they continue to escalate the crisis.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
I will yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to respond the gentleman from Alabama's comments about an amendment I plan to offer in a few minutes. I just want to remind everyone that suspending military cooperation, that was already one of the first acts that our administration already did. That is done. So the purpose of the amendment I will be offering is to reach out to those other countries, our allies in Central Europe and our NATO members, to do the same as we're doing. So just to clarify that, Mr. Chairman, before I offer the amendment, I want that point clarified.
All
I
right.
yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on the bipartisan en bloc amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to. Does Mr. William Keating have an amendment at the desk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.Res. 499, offered by Mr. Keating of Massachusetts. On page 5, between the 8th and 9th resolved clauses, insert the following new paragraph.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. The chair recognizes Mr. Keating from Massachusetts to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. NATO Secretary General Rasmussen announced that NATO was suspending most of the alliance's meetings with Russia and was reviewing the entire range of NATO-Russia cooperation. The Baltic states, Poland, and other allies in Central Europe have called on NATO members and the EU to impose an arms embargo. The UK has said it's reviewing its arms exports to Russia. However, other NATO members have said an arms embargo would be premature. The key reason, of course, is concern about possible revenue losses. This amendment calls on European allies to suspend export of military equipment that could be used to support Russian aggression in the region. This is an obvious step for allies to take in response to an unprovoked act of military aggression in their own neighborhood. I ask for support of this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Do any other members seek recognition? Any further debate on this amendment? Hearing no further request for time, we'll go then to the vote on the amendment. All those in favor of Mr. Keating's amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? The chair recognizes Mr. Poe of Texas.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.Res. 499, offered by Mr. Poe of Texas. Page 6, line 9, strike quote and. Page 6, after line.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered read. The chair recognizes the author to explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Well, Russia's doing being the poet these days. First, the Russians moved into Moldova in 1992. They moved into Georgia in 2008. I happened to be in Georgia 2 weeks after the tanks came rolling in. And now they're doing the same thing with the Ukraine. This is not the first time the Russians have shown economic political weapon of natural gas against the Ukrainians. They've turned off the gas twice before. And once again, I happened to be in the Ukraine when they turned off the gas in winter, and it was cold. And it was for political reasons, but it was an economic weapon that the Russians used against the Ukrainian people. As we look at the Ukrainian situation, it's a situation that is bigger than just the Ukraine. It's the Russian influence of on the region and holding that region hostage with the use of energy, primarily natural gas. This past weekend, the Russians even warned that Ukraine's discount on natural gas was in jeopardy. But there's something that we can do not only to help the Ukrainians, but help stability in the area and help the United States as well. And that's by selling American natural gas to the Ukrainians, the former Soviet republics, even to Western Europe. There is a demand, and the American supply is overwhelming. We have more natural gas than we can use in the United States. Our current reserves are roughly 97 times what the U.S. consumed in all of 2011. There is so much natural gas in North Dakota that there are 15 flare-ups now, which would be equivalent to heating over 1 million homes. That is gas that they are burning off. We have abundant natural gas in this country, primarily in Texas. There's an ice cream company in Texas that says, Bluebell, it's the best in the world, by the way, that says, as their commercial, we eat all we can and we sell the rest. Well, I think that should be our policy with natural gas. We use all we can and we sell the rest. And here's an opportunity that we could buttress the economic, political weapon the Russians are using against the former Soviet republics to bring them back, and that's the use of natural gas. And this legislation would simply put part of this bill, a requirement that the United States have a policy of moving forward with exporting natural gas to the Ukraine and other countries. According to the New York Times, the Obama administration is pushing the idea. The head of the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources, Carlos Pascual, is a former Ukrainian ambassador to Ukraine. He said Gazprom's influence will be weakened as American supplies are shipped onto the global market. And his team is already working to help the Ukraine and other countries break away from the dependence of Russian natural gas. And American exports would send a signal that the global gas market is changing and the United States is a player, but also the Russian influence economically and politically is diminishing. So my amendment calls for our government to increase American natural gas exports to the Ukraine, the former Soviet republics, and European countries. And I reserve.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd just like to correct the record in one respect. I agree with everything that the gentleman said, except the greatest ice cream in the world is made in Cincinnati. It's Grader's ice cream. So I yield back.
Do you export it?
Yes, we do. Everybody loves it.
I reserve.
Mr. Sherman of California.
I rise in opposition, reluctant opposition to my colleague's amendment. I think it's important that we have a resolution that passes overwhelmingly on the floor of the House in just a few hours. It would be brought up under a suspension. The way to do that is to focus on where we're unified, which is our foreign policy toward the Ukraine. This House is not all that unified on energy policy. As a matter of fact, we just had votes on the floor of the House where there was substantial opposition to a bill dealing with energy policy. I think we've got another energy policy vote this afternoon, which will not pass on a suspension. The issue of exporting natural gas is controversial as a domestic issue. Consumers in the United States, and especially manufacturers in the United States, enjoy the fact that natural gas prices are substantially lower than they are on the world market. Exporting natural gas would then cause Americans and others to pay the world price. In addition, I don't have to tell the gentleman that we have some environmentalists in our caucus that do not want to see an increase in fracking and increase in natural gas production. And regardless of where any member stands here on whether we should export natural gas, whether federal land should be open to more exploration, I would call upon everyone